March 1945. A small village on the road to Trier, Rhineland, Germany. The morning mist clings to the cobblestones and the gray stone walls of the cottages. Mud from the spring thaw coats the boots of retreating soldiers and the wheels of their carts. A column of German infantry moves slowly through the main square, heading east away from the approaching roar of American engines. But they are not alone. In front of the gray uniforms and the steel helmets is a line of 60 people. They are women in wool coats, elderly men leaning on canes, and children who look no older than 6. They are being forced forward at the point of a bayonet. This is a wall of living flesh designed to stop a bullet. The German commander knows the Americans are close. He also knows they will not fire on their own allies or innocent civilians. It is a calculation made of cold steel and cowardice. Patton will answer this calculation with a verdict that ensures the guilty cannot hide behind the innocent. This is the story of what happened when German soldiers used children as human shields and Patton refused to let the crime stand. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show justice, consequences, and the moments that changed history. In the chaos of the final retreat, some men abandoned their honor to save their skins. But they soon learned that Third Army had a very different definition of survival. Captain Leo Marchetti was 29 years old and hailed from the brick row houses of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He served as a company commander within a Sherman tank battalion, and he carried the weight of the war in the pockets of his grease-stained field jacket. Before the draft board called his name, he had worked as a junior architect, designing homes for families just like his own. He was a man who understood how things were built, and he loathed the way the war tore them down. He had 2 young children waiting for him back in Philly, and he carried their crumpled photographs tucked inside his helmet liner for luck. Every decision he made on the battlefield was filtered through the lens of those 2 faces. He had seen enough fire and steel to last 3 lifetimes, but nothing had prepared him for the sight he saw through his tank optics on the road to Trier. He sat in the commander's hatch with his thumb hovering near the fire control button, staring at a target he knew he could never hit. Opposite him stood Hauptmann Klaus Reicher. Reicher was 38 years old and a career infantry officer in the Wehrmacht who had spent 3 brutal years on the Eastern Front. He was a man who believed that the survival of his unit justified any cost, and he viewed the laws of war as luxury items that Germany could no longer afford. He wore a tailored tunic that remained remarkably clean despite the retreat, and an iron cross hung prominently from his neck. Reicher often told his subordinates that the Americans were weak because they were sentimental. He believed their morality was a tactical vulnerability to be exploited. To Reicher, the 60 French and Luxembourg civilians he had rounded up were not human beings with lives and names. They were simply ballistic shields. He had specifically ordered the youngest children to the front of the column because he knew the sight would paralyze an American gunner's heart. He stood at the rear of the march, checking his silver pocket watch, confident that his cleverness would buy him a safe passage across the Rhine. By March 1945, the German war machine was a shattered mirror, reflecting only the chaos of its own collapse. The Third Reich was no longer a functioning state, but a series of desperate pockets fighting for minutes of survival. In the Rhineland, the Siegfried Line had been breached, and the Rhine River was the final obstacle between the Allies and the heart of Germany. German units were often cut off from their headquarters, and supply lines were non-existent. Discipline was fraying, and the distinction between regular soldiers and the desperate remnants of the SS was beginning to blur. Some commanders chose to surrender to save their men, while others turned toward increasingly barbaric methods to delay the inevitable. The road to Trier was a strategic artery, and as the Americans pushed eastward, they found a landscape of abandoned equipment and ruined villages. In this climate of desperation, some German officers had begun to adopt the scorched earth and total war tactics they had perfected on the Eastern Front. They believed that the Western Allies were soft and that their democratic values could be used as a weapon against them. They calculated that an American tank commander would rather let a battalion of Germans escape than risk the life of a single non-combatant. It was a gamble based on the assumption that the Americans followed rules that the Germans had long since discarded. Most Allied officers faced with such a choice were paralyzed by the moral weight of the situation, often halting their entire advance and allowing the enemy to slip away into the forests. They feared the military police and the international headlines that followed accidental civilian casualties. This hesitation was exactly what the retreating forces relied upon to reach the safety of the eastern bank. The German column continued its slow march through the village square, certain that the silence of the American tanks was a sign of total submission to their grim ultimatum. Captain Marchetti gripped his radio handset so tight his knuckles turned white. He watched through his binoculars as the German column trudged through the center of the village. The sight was sickening. A small girl in a tattered red coat was being shoved forward by the barrel of a Kar 98K rifle. She was stumbling over the uneven stones. Reicher stood on the back of a half-track with his arms crossed and a smirk playing on his thin lips. He looked directly at the American tank line and tapped his watch. Marchetti keyed his mic and called for a parley. He climbed down from his Sherman and walked 50 yards into the no-man's land of the village square. Reicher met him halfway, flanked by 2 stone-faced sergeants. Marchetti did not salute. He pointed a gloved finger at the shivering group of civilians. "You are going to release those people right now," Marchetti said. His voice was low and shaking with suppressed rage. Reicher adjusted his cap and looked at the American with an expression of bored amusement. "I believe you are in no position to issue demands, Captain," Reicher replied. "My men are simply conducting a tactical withdrawal, and these loyal citizens are assisting us in ensuring a peaceful transition." Marchetti stepped closer until he could smell the schnapps on the German's breath. "Those are children." "Reicher, you are using babies as sandbags. It's a war crime and you know it." Reicher laughed, a dry and hollow sound. "War is a series of choices, Captain. I choose to live. You choose to be a slave to your conscience. If you fire one shell, you will be the butcher of Trier, not me. Think of the paperwork. Think of your own soul." Marchetti's hand drifted toward his holster, but he stopped. He knew Reicher wanted a provocation. He knew the German was betting his entire life on the idea that an American would never pull the trigger if a child was in the way. Reicher leaned in and whispered, "You will sit in your metal boxes and you will watch us walk away because you are weak. Your morality is your cage." Marchetti backed away slowly, never taking his eyes off the German. He reached his tank and climbed the hull. He didn't radio his battalion commander. He bypassed the entire chain of command and sent an urgent priority flash directly to 3rd Army headquarters. He described the human shields, the children, and the laughing officer. He told them he was holding fire, but he couldn't hold the line forever. The response came back in less than 10 minutes. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. The rumble of his modified jeep was unmistakable, cutting through the heavy silence that had settled over the village square. He sat in the passenger seat, his posture as straight as a bayonet. The 4 silver stars on his helmet caught the pale German sun, and the ivory grips of his revolvers shone against his side. He didn't wait for a salute. He hopped down from the vehicle before it had fully stopped, his boots clicking sharply on the cobblestones. He walked past the idling Shermans and straight toward the German line, his eyes fixed on the man in the clean tunic. Everyone in the square felt the temperature drop. The soldiers on both sides held their breath as the old man came to a halt 10 feet from the German officer. He didn't look at the civilians first. He looked at Reicher. Patton studied him for a long moment before he spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried to the back of the column. "Are you the officer in charge of this retreating rabble?" Patton asked. Reicher stood taller, attempting to reclaim his vanishing dignity. "I am Hauptmann Klaus Reicher," he answered, "and these are my charges." Patton tilted his head slightly. "You find it necessary to have children lead your march?" he asked. Reicher gave a sharp nod. "It is a protective measure allowed by the necessity of the situation," the German said. "You would not fire on them." Patton took a step closer. "You believe that your life is worth the lives of these 60 people?" he asked. Reicher looked at the girl in the red coat and then back at Patton. "In this war, survival is the only law that matters," the German replied. Patton stood perfectly still. "You have made a mistake, Hauptmann," he began. "You believe you have found a loophole in the rules of civilization. You think that by dragging children into the mud, you have created a shield that my men cannot penetrate. You look at Captain Marchetti and you see a man restricted by his conscience. You see a man who remembers his own children and hesitates. You call that weakness. I call it the reason we are going to win this war while you are reduced to hiding behind skirts and strollers. You have spent years on the Eastern Front learning how to be a coward. You brought those tactics here thinking we would be intimidated by your lack of humanity. But you've forgotten one thing. I do not need a tank to destroy a man like you. You claim these people are helping you. I say you are kidnapping them. You have exactly 1 minute to release every single civilian and order your men to stack their arms. If you do not, I will not order my tanks to fire. I will send my infantry through those woods to cut your throat from behind. I will ensure you are captured alive, photographed with these children, and handed over to a tribunal that will hang you before the month is out. You will not die as a soldier. You will die as a common criminal. The choice is yours. Release them or face the consequences. Patton stared into Reicher's eyes, and for the first time, the German officer looked away. The order was given with the surgical precision that defined the Third Army's movements. While the German column sat frozen under the gaze of the Shermans, a platoon of American infantry slipped away into the thick German timber. They moved like ghosts through the underbrush, circling wide around the village to seal the only exit. 2 hours passed in a silent, suffocating standoff. Then the trap snapped shut. A single green flare hissed into the gray sky from the far side of the road. Reicher looked back and saw a wall of American olive drab blocking his path. He looked forward and saw the steel muzzles of Marchetti's tanks. The civilians were caught in the middle, but the leverage was gone. One by one, the German soldiers began to lower their rifles. They looked at the children, then at the 4-star general, and they chose life. Reicher's hand trembled as he signaled the release. The 60 women and children were pulled away by American GIs, ushered into the safety of the stone cottages with chocolate bars and quiet reassurances. As the civilians cleared the square, Patton's MPs moved in. They didn't just take Reicher's pistol. They forced him to stand in front of the very children he had used as armor. A Signal Corps photographer captured the moment, the flashbulbs burning the image of the coward's face into history. Reicher smelled the exhaust of the idling tanks and the cold sweat of his own fear as he was marched away, no longer an officer, but a prisoner destined for a dock in a courtroom. Captain Leo Marchetti returned to Philadelphia in the fall of 1945. He never built another house. Instead, he took a job teaching vocational skills to veterans, helping men with shaking hands find a steady rhythm in carpentry and trade. He raised his 2 children and spoke of the war only when the winter air made his old wounds ache. He kept a small, framed photograph in his study, not of a tank or a medal, but of a small girl in a tattered red coat. He lived a quiet, honorable life and passed away in 1982 at the age of 66. He was remembered by his neighbors as a man who knew the value of a life held in the balance. Hauptmann Klaus Reicher did not find the clean escape he had envisioned. The photographs taken in that village square became key evidence in a military tribunal. He was convicted of war crimes and served 12 years in a high-security prison before being released into a Germany that no longer recognized his ideology. He lived out his remaining years in a small apartment in Hamburg, working as a clerk, and remaining bitter until his death in 1974. He often wrote letters to newspapers, complaining about the lack of respect for the old officer class. But the world had moved on from men who hid behind children. General George Patton mentioned the incident only once in a private letter to his wife, Beatrice. He wrote that the hardest part of command was not finding the courage to kill the enemy, but finding the restraint to save the innocent. He noted that Marchetti had shown the heart of a lion by keeping his finger off the trigger. Patton's official report on the incident remained buried in the archives for decades, a silent testament to a day when 4 stars stood up for 60 souls. He never sought praise for the standoff, believing that justice was its own reward. Some historians argue that Patton's decision to delay a direct engagement for several hours was a reckless gamble with tactical momentum. They suggest that in the brutal arithmetic of 1945, allowing an armed enemy battalion to regroup and dig in behind a roadblock could have cost more American lives than a swift, decisive strike on the column itself. These critics point to the standard military doctrine of the era, which often prioritized the destruction of the enemy's fighting capacity above all other concerns. Other historians argue the opposite, maintaining that Patton's restraint was a masterclass in psychological warfare and moral leadership. They contend that by refusing to play the enemy's game, he preserved the ethical standing of the Allied cause and prevented a propaganda victory for the crumbling Reich. What is certain is that the 60 civilians returned to their homes alive, and the photographs of the encounter became an enduring record of the moment the German army lost its claim to professional honor. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have prioritized the military objective over the lives of those civilians? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about justice, consequences, and the moments that changed history, make sure to subscribe.